Good morning. Welcome to Hillsdale College's Kirby Center. My name is David Bobb. I serve as director here. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome you all to our first Principles on First Friday's lecture of 2012. We're really delighted today that we're joined by one of the leading political scientists in not only this country, but anywhere. Jim Caesar has taught at the University of Virginia and has done so in a wide array of subjects, including the one on which he'll be speaking today. Before he is introduced formally, I'd like to commend to your attention one of his most recent books. It's a collection of essays about the Constitution and constitutionalism. It's called Designing a Polity, America's Constitution in Theory and Practice. It's available in hard copy as well as an ebook, and you can find it online. It's really a great collection of illuminating essays. I'll have a few announcements about upcoming events. January is a busy month for us here, and we'd like to invite you to be part of a number of occasions that we'll be having this month and next. But we'd like to get to our topic this morning. It's the 2012 election, America's Moment of Truth. To introduce our speaker this morning, a native of Miami, Florida, who is experiencing winter for the first time. Today's not so wintry here in Washington, D.C. We might have to send him to our campus in Michigan, where it's just a little bit colder now. Ed Walton is serving as an intern with the Kirby Center. Ed.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. James W. Caesar is the Harry F. Byrd Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia, where he has taught since 1976. He's the author of several books, including Nature and History in American Political Development, Presidential Selection, Liberal Democracy and Political Science, and The Perfect Tie, the true story of the 2000 presidential election, co-authored with Andrew Bush. He has held visiting professorships at the University of Florence, the University of Basel, Oxford University, and the University of Bordeaux. He received his PhD in government from Harvard University. Today he will be speaking on the topic, the 2012 election, America's Moment of Truth. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Caesar.
Well, thanks, Ed, for the very kind comments and introduction. I traveled up here this morning on the train from Charlottesville, enjoying our good old American high-speed train, which ambles gently along at about 40 miles an hour. In contrast to the more than 250 kilometers a mile that one finds on the French TGV, of which our president dreams fondly every night, I'm sure. Incidentally, I'm reminded here that the West was won inch by inch, not centimeter by centimeter. Back to this train, which passes through some of the loveliest scenery Virginia has to offer, allowing one, when you take account of the speed, to cultivate what John Coranson referred to as affections and long memories that attach to ancient bowers of life in the provinces. And it also affords you some time to reflect, say, on what to put into a lecture. Well, one nice innovation on this train, organically grown, has been the internet. And in consulting the Hillsdale website on the way up, I observed that it placed this talk right square in the middle of Punditland. I quote, "With the Iowa caucuses held on January 3rd and the New Hampshire primary a week later, this presentation will outline what is at stake." Now, if the politics of the moment is my charge, then David must have mistaken me for my colleague, Larry Sabato, whom I see from time to time on CNN or Fox. For I raise the self-evident question, what could possibly be added to the cornucopia of political analysis that flows daily from our airways, newspapers, and blogs? I think when historians look back on our day, I'm sure that they will, what will strike them most about our campaigns is really not the vast sums of money spent on the races, but the extravagant application of intellectual energy, some of it by the nation's finest minds, to the analysis of each and every aspect of this ongoing event. I wouldn't want to lament the waste of intellectual resources devoted to this object, except you might ask what these people would be doing if they weren't talking about the campaign. But the attention given to the campaign is at least extraordinary. It already struck Tocqueville in 1832, and he was referring only to the final election campaign. Here is a citation from Tocqueville, an obligatory gesture at any Hillsdale presentation. He said, "The election is the daily theme of comment in the newspapers and conversation, the subject of events thought, and the interest of the moment." Incidentally, Tocqueville worried about national elections, especially those in which an incumbent was running, as the effect, and I quote him, was to replace patriotism of the incumbent with trickery. Listen to this passage, which I'll read. "It is impossible to observe the normal course of affairs in the United States without noticing that desire for re-election dominates the president's thoughts, and the whole policy of his administration is bent towards that aim, that his slightest actions are subordinate to that aim, and that, particularly at the moment as the election draws near, his private interest takes the place of the general interest in his mind." Did I say that this was written by Tocqueville or Charles Krautheimer? Well, not to ignore completely the charge that has been assigned to me, I now offer, I think, 9 minutes, no more, of boilerplate political analysis before turning to the subject today, which I already adumbrated in the remarks about trains, and that is what is at stake in 2012, beyond the nomination, is a choice even in the minds of many Americans, between America and Europe. Many are thinking in these terms, and many of the candidates, I'm speaking of the Republicans, frame the election as an election in just this way, America or Europe. Well, now for the punditry, which draws from a simple framework of categories that Andrew Bush and I have used in a series of election books that dates back to 1992. The framework simply reminds us of the three general factors that voters weigh in making their nomination choices. How they weigh these different factors depends on each voter, the timing in the process, and, of course, the election year, but it's a rough way to begin analysis. The three factors are, first, the issue position, or more generally, the ideological slot of the candidates. So let's say something this year like libertarian, conservative, less conservative, or maybe moderate conservative. In other words, there's a slotting of candidates that voters weigh and that candidates themselves try to influence. We see this going on even now with Newt Gingrich trying to slot all of his friends, the triumvirate of himself, Santorum, and Perry, against what he calls a moderate candidate, Mitt Romney. Second is the personal quality of the candidate, his or her perceived competence, stature, connectedness to people like us, and, of course, electability. Third is what one can call a mood or theme, indicating, for example, if people seem to have it in for insiders or people in government or in the federal government, whether they're politicians or not, themes like that. Well, let's begin by looking at this last one, the mood, which has probably been the least important in this campaign, but still not insignificant. Its use could be seen in, and still can be seen in the stump speeches of the candidate. Rick Perry stresses that he's not from Washington. Herman Cain made it a selling point that he was a businessman and not a politician. And Mitt Romney, too, mentions that he's a businessman as the first element of his speech, even if it was only because he could not make it in the NFL. In a party that this year is seeking to limit and constrain big government, there's some, obviously, advantage in this posture of not being a Washington insider. Still, it hasn't been decisive. a candidate from Washington can claim that he or she was instrumental in fighting big government there in Washington. And I think this worked pretty well for Michelle Bachmann. It worked for Newt so far as he was speaker and leader of the revolution of '94, though he was obviously caught on the defensive greatly for his enterprise afterwards that fed off Washington contracts, which made him look more like a Washington insider. And this could be an issue for Rick Santorum. Now, the current conservative coming on, whom the other Rick, as Rick Perry, are already targeted for being a major earmarker and pork barreler. So Santorum may at least have some explaining to do on this theme of mood. Next is the factor of the personal attributes of the candidates. To date, this has probably been the key or most important factor in this nomination race. To this point, the candidates have fallen out of contention, those who have, less for any rejection of their ideological positions or for mood than for their perceived inadequacy as credible candidates or persons for the presidency. I mean, you can go through the list, beginning with Donald Trump, who sort of proved himself a clown, Michelle Bachmann, who was impressive in some ways, but thought by many not to be quite up for prime time, Herman Cain, who obviously fell because of certain personal problems, Governor Perry, for lack of skill in debate, and made him look, I think many people turned on him for that reason. Newt Gingrich for a number of things, but I think also certain questions about whether he's would be the sort of person you'd want as president. Santorum has not yet gone through this process, and we'll see how he comes out. So I think this has been a key element in this campaign, which leaves one person, Mitt Romney. Now, when you look at Mitt Romney's persona, it's true that he began as the only candidate, Gingrich aside, whom everyone in America and the Republicans knew about before. The others had to make a name. He didn't have to make a name for himself. People knew who he was from the last campaign. So he didn't face the problem of getting himself known. He's been called and was called the front runner. Curious, though. If you actually look after August, who was leading the polls most of the time nationally, it really wasn't Mitt Romney. So curious kind of front runner, if he should be called the front runner. Well, of course, now he is, but most of the time he was behind either Gingrich or Cain or Perry. Still, I think as a candidate, he's shown himself, if not perfect, to be the one that has emerged, I think in the consensus of everyone, as someone who's competent and presidential. So while the others have fallen for lack of it, he's at least maintained his credibility as a kind of viable presidential timber, and maybe the only one to have done so far. There's some other aspects of his persona that are interesting. People reflected early on the fact that he's a Mormon, which may have hurt him getting some votes with some segments of evangelical Christians. But I really think the real point is not, once you leave theology aside, is not the fact that he's Mormon, but really that he's WASP, our typical WASP. Seen him speak and followed him around a little bit in New Hampshire. He doesn't easily connect with the average guy because he's not the average guy in any way. He's come up in an affluent background. He's had the best education imaginable. Don't tell anyone he speaks French. So people can admire and respect him, but they don't easily cozy up to him, and could have problems in some places in that regard. Although, that being said, if he's ever the nominee, I don't think this will be a major problem for him. The sorts of people that he won't cozy up to will nevertheless, I think, prefer his elitism to Obama's elitism. That is a business elitism or WASP elitism to an intellectual snobbery. He's said to be the establishment candidate now because of this whole bevy of endorsements he's received, including from such preppies as Dan Quayle and George Bush Sr., maybe not the sort of people that Romney wants to see himself hanging out with when you think about it. Sometimes, or some of this may have been for the reason of where he stands politically, but I would say actually he's been endorsed in spite of where he stands politically. Or at least that hasn't been the major factor. He's been endorsed because of the judgments about his persona or person, that he's the only or most competent candidate in the race, and that the others don't measure up. You could easily imagine many of the people who are endorsing, who have endorsed and will endorse Mitt Romney, you could easily have imagined them endorsing someone else if that someone else were in the race. In fact, they would have preferred a more conservative candidate, certainly a candidate who wasn't attached to Romney care. So this isn't, these endorsements aren't an establishment circling around Romney to protect the kind of moderate republicanism, but a recognition, I would say, mostly something about estimates of his persona. Finally, when you look at this tripartite analysis, there's the slot or ideology. And this turns out, as in many races, there are often primaries going on within primaries. That is, you have a slot, like in this race, the conservatives, and there's a race among those. And so there's two races going on at once. Now, in this race, if you want to try and indicate the different slots, it's clear that there's one division that all agree on, and that is libertarianism versus all the rest. That's a recognized slot. And then what is the rest? Well, it's not perfectly clear because the candidates don't own up to these divisions, but you could say, and the media have said, well, there's conservative, less conservative, and moderate. So that gives you four positions, libertarian, conservative, less conservative, and moderate. And when you look at the race, only one slot really has competition. The libertarian competition was over pretty early. It was Ron Paul versus Gary Johnson, remember him, and that slot was decided almost before it began. The quasi-moderate, if you want to call him, at least for a day or two, was Ambassador Huntsman. He has this slot all to himself if he wants it, though he spent much of the time, at least since the couple days around his announcement, trying to abandon his own category and join some other one. No one has quite adopted him. And Romney maybe doesn't want it, but he has the less conservative slot all to himself, or soon will, if he defeats Huntsman in New Hampshire. So the only slot where there's a race within a race is the conservative slot. It's the only one with an internal primary. Now, some have wondered whether this is really a slot or just the anti-Romney position. Well, probably it's a little bit of both, but at least when most people look at it, they perceive all of the other candidates to have been more conservative than Romney. Be that as it may, the candidates in this slot have debated each other whether they are truly conservative, and have attacked each other for not being true conservatives. So there has been a kind of race going on within the conservatives that has involved ideology, although, as I mentioned, it seems to me the major reason why people have fallen in this category has not been so much their defects of ideology, but inadequacies in their perceptions of personal competence. Newt Gingrich, having fallen himself, he's not out of it yet, certainly, has a new strategy. Some see him just being angry. He's compared himself, I know, to Churchill and Washington, but others now are comparing him perhaps to Achilles, brooding in his tent. But anyhow, he has this new strategy of trying to combine the remaining three conservatives into a condominium. And he's speaking of them now as a group, me, Rick Perry, and Rick Santorum, to somehow eliminate Romney before these three turn on themselves, as triumvirates always do. Well, no one's quite sure how or whether this strategy can work out or whether it's coherent, but it's one of the new things that's come up in the last week. Well, for a few months now, to go back to the pundits, I've tried to at least predict what the race would be in terms of percentages, and I'll stick to the prediction. This goes all the way back to September, I think. I gave Romney 70 chances in 100. The rest of the active field, that is all the other active candidates, 3 chances in 100, and 17 chances in 100 to someone who's not in the field. I don't know if I'd exactly stick with that, but that's pretty much where I would be today. What's the path to victory for Romney? Well, it involves the continuation of the internal primary among the conservatives so that their votes split for a while until it's too late. And if you can imagine this continuing to happen through South Carolina, a kind of split, and then by that time maybe it's too late for anyone to catch on. Remember, John McCain pretty much won the election last time because the other category split, not because he was, I think, held the best position. And then, this is maybe a stronger point for why Romney would win. He wins against any conservative in the field on the idea of his personality or persona. Because, and here would be the reasons, because he's deemed to be more presidential. And also, I'd add this, because after you get past the first number of these races, it turns out that when you look at the Republican electorate, while conservative group is larger than the less conservative is a pretty big group, larger than one would think than when you look just at Iowa. So he would have some ideological support, but also I think the element would turn on his persona, his competence and electability. Well, the Santorum path, if he's the one to victory, you could see where that could occur, that really the largest single element is the conservative one. If he can consolidate this and not suffer from any of the major personal flaws that all the other conservatives, that has brought all the other conservatives down, well, why not? That would be plausible, and that's his hope, and time will tell. Let's go to the brokered convention scenario. This was bandied about a little bit in Washington with someone else getting into the race. I believe that never was going to happen. No one's going to get into the race and start running in the primaries now. The way this would happen would be quite different. It would be more like a modern draft. The situation would evolve something like this. For this, you need three candidates besides Mitt Romney. That is not just Ron Paul, but a couple of others. So that there's a split of delegates among the candidates, Ron Paul accepted. He's going to get what he's going to get. Because in any two-person race, even if you don't like the two candidates, someone wins. That's by definition, two candidates, someone wins. So you need, I think, three. And it would be based on the fact that no candidate gets a majority of the delegates, and that and this I think is something we already know, there's not a passionate gut commitment to the likely leader, which would be Mitt Romney. And I think that's pretty clear about his campaign. You can see this from the crowds if you've been to his rallies. There's not that sort of commitment that either, say, Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama had. Not that people don't like him, it just doesn't bring out that visceral connection. So I can't imagine people fighting to the death for any of these candidates. So it would require, as I said, a split among Romney and two of the conservatives. They would have to hang on, because if it was just between Romney and one other conservative, even if neither got a majority, Ron Paul would be able to decide the difference. So that would be the basis of this. People would conclude, gee, we really don't have anyone who has a majority or near majority without much support. Enter some of the candidates that many have wanted in that perfect sweet spot. That's a sweet spot of someone a little bit more conservative than Romney, acceptable to all the conservatives, yet acceptable as a mainline candidate with personal credentials. Gee, a lot of people thought that was going to be Governor Pawlenty, and I think he made a serious mistake in pulling out. He might have had a second look and might have looked better. But there are others, obviously, in that slot. It could be Paul Ryan. It could be Jeb Bush. Who knows? And I would imagine this happening, therefore, this minority possibility, in a kind of draft movement emanating from some of the delegates who had something whispered in their ear by Washington insiders about how to do this. That would probably present a unity ticket. That is president and vice president together. A very attractive ticket. You can put together any pairs in that group, and you can imagine how attractive that would be. So that, in my view, is still remains more probable outcome than any other candidate except Mitt Romney, who by far I think has the best position. Well, although this race may be decided in terms of how many vote on matters, speaking now of the final election race, the important ones, it could be decided on many matters like the vagaries of the performance of the economy. Yet I think beneath the decision of voters, when you look at its significance in a larger context, what all the thinking classes have in mind, you understand what an important election it will be. Republicans have looked for a way to phrase this. And beginning in 2010, they elevated the theme of exceptionalism as the symbol which points the difference between them and Democrats. I think Mark Rubio made this the theme of his 2010 campaign. He still believes in exceptionalism. Romney uses it in his speech, and Newt Gingrich published a book on this theme issued the very week in which he announced his candidacy a long time ago. And exceptionalism is a wonderful phrase that evokes all sorts of warm feelings among, I think, conservatives. The problem is that while it's nice and poetic, it doesn't get directly to what's at stake, because people say, oh yes, I like exceptionalism, but then they have different understandings of what it means. It could be this, it could be that. America's strength in foreign affairs, lots of liberty. It seems to break down the moment you get beneath the word itself. So another way to think about how many Americans conceive of this race, even if this won't be the dominant theme inside the election in for popular mobilization, is how Americans conceive of Europe. There is this fact to keep in mind. Just a few years ago, I'd say even 2 years ago, but certainly going back to the time of the 2008 campaign and up until 2010, Europe was this symbol of envy for the liberal intelligentsia. You could say they suffered from Euro envy. They spoke about it all the time as the model, a little bit more cautiously in public, but still, go back and read the accounts of the intelligentsia. Europe was the model. Now you hardly hear it whispered. There are grounds, if we analyze this perhaps, for some hope for Republicans. Well, what was the image of Europe going into 2008? And I think, in a way, both parties agreed on this as the image, even though they evaluated it differently. Here are the various elements of what Europe was. I mentioned 3 or 4 points in the minds of the intelligentsia. Well, first, Europe meant a large welfare state and a more managed economy. It was managed capitalism, and as you know, Europeans continually have attacked the United States for its ultra-capitalism, or capitalism on steroids. It's cowboy capitalism, meaning that we don't regulate capitalism sufficiently. And of course, a much larger welfare state designed not only to get benefits to others, but to reduce explicitly inequalities in society. The income spread in the United States was always a matter of something that Europeans have attacked. Of course, it means high-speed trains. That's a cardinal element of what Europe stands for. And it means restrictions on labor markets and protection of labor markets and pensions. So you could say it's a view, to put it in more theoretical terms, a view in which the state, or you could say society, collectively owns the wealth and distributes it fairly. As distinct from the United States, where at least the initial starting point was or used to be that, gee, everyone keeps what he makes, giving only what's necessary to keep the government going. That would be a little bit of the difference. Next, these are maybe lesser elements of the current campaign, but these are important elements of what Europe meant in 2008. Europe was desirable for the Europeans and for the American left because it presented itself as a post-national entity. It had gotten beyond, or was in the process of getting beyond, the nation state, spreading out, pooling sovereignty. The nation state was regarded as something old, and to such an extent, well, let's not forget this, that Europe had the idea, which many people are scratching their head a little bit, that Europe would soon include Turkey, and the states of the Maghreb was proposed. Well, why not? if the notion is somehow that nations don't matter, which was the European idea, this would serve as a model not only for Europe, but for the world. So in combination with Europe and the development of Europe was also the development of more and more international institutions like international criminal courts and international accords as a new model to bring peace inside the world, which would downplay the nation state as really the central entity of organization of the world. It's a slow movement towards world government. Really, it was a kind of model that Europe represented, as I said, in a way that many thought very desirable. And then added to this is the European view that, this entity would be secular and non-foundational. Secular meaning it wouldn't be attached even by admission to any religious preference. You recall the European Constitution was this vague language that someone wanted to put in that at least Europe had culturally been Christian. No, left out. This is going to be secular and non-foundational, meaning you wouldn't mention anything like natural rights or anything that had some metaphysical grounding to it. Rather, what would hold this idea, hold the thing together, would be something like universal values. Where the universal values being things derived loosely from liberalism in a certain way, things like being humane, tolerant, social justice, so therefore the equality aspect, things like that, but they change a little bit as time goes on. But these would be the nice things that would hold this together and eventually the world together. This, I think, was the plan. And finally, the Europeans believed, and I think American liberals believed, that this was somehow the wave of the future, that it had the wind behind its back or history behind its back, and that it was going to leave behind the nation state, leave behind those who cling stubbornly to their patriotism and their constitution. That, I think, was what this was the key about. Now, this favorable, as I said, liberals regarded this favorably, more or less. Conservatives agreed on the elements of it, but regarded it with hostility. I think the liberals' case, at least for liberals, was strengthened as a result of momentarily as a result of the crash in 2008. In the narrative that was presented after 2008, it proves at least a good part of the European case. Where did this crash begin? In the United States. And where was it thought to begin? In the financial markets of the United States, unrestrained, unregulated. It all came from Wall Street in this view. All of which proved, in a way, at least to the Europeans and to many of the liberals, the European case. Gee, there really is something fundamentally wrong with the American model, and the European model was the preferable one. Now we can speak of the moment of turn. This is interesting, because I said this grew into 2008 and 2009. What is it that began the turn in the view of Europe? Well, whatever the cause of this crash, here's one point. It became clear to many pretty early on that Europe seemed to have no way of getting out of the economic doldrums. Its economy, which suffered more than ours, even though the crash began here, its economy didn't seem to have the dynamism for growth. And of course, even in the European model, it was always admitted that growth was less important than equity. They would trade some degree of growth for equity. But now, in a period of mounting unemployment, which reached much higher proportions in Europe than here, it was seen that this was a weakness in Europe. Where was the capacity for getting ourselves out of this? Whatever got us into it, what would get us out of it? Europe didn't seem to be the model. But the more important point is in one word, which Greece. Here we see the advent of another problem. Was the problem, or is the problem we face really the financial crisis of 2008? Or is it something that was much deeper that was masked until now? And though it's mixed up in many people's mind with the financial crisis, one sees immediately that it's entirely independent of it. That is, that the welfare states, many of the welfare states, have spent well beyond their means. Their indebtedness is gigantic. So is the problem then the financial crisis of 2008 or the crisis of indebtedness? This would be what Greece has meant. The symbol of this crisis in the public mind, namely that a nation can go broke, a nation that can spend itself into bankruptcy, a welfare state can spend so much that it can no longer maintain itself. The symbol of this has become Greece, and it's one of the most potent symbols of American politics in this election year. You can go out to the hustings today and mention Greece, of all things, and people have some idea of what that means now. It means a government that spent itself so much into debt that it goes bankrupt. You could maybe mention Illinois or California, but they're not there yet. We're working on it, yeah. And it's a tangible sign because, as I mentioned, people usually don't vote on theory. At least many of the average voters don't vote on theory. They vote on something that they can see. And this is the tangible importance of Greece. And now this symbol of Greece dovetailed in the United States with a movement that sought to return to the founding and the Constitution, in the belief that the founding of the Constitution somehow holds the key to restraining indebtedness. Well, whatever the merits of this belief, it turns out that the authors of the Federalist Papers also recur to the example of Greece, classical Greece in their case, to illustrate a central problem of Republican government in America of their day, namely majority faction, one group voting away the rights of another. The two Greek problems, though different on the surface, in fact overlap. In our time, the danger of faction assumes a slightly different form. It assumes the form of a majority in one generation dispossessing the rights of those in the generation to come. This generation, our generation, let me say my generation, perhaps was deluded by unsound economic theories and irresponsible politicians. It perhaps came to the belief that someone or something other than themselves would magically cover the gap between what people want from government and what they're willing to pay. Whatever the source of the problems, the facts are there. This generation is responsible for it. Thomas Jefferson surely had a point in declaring that no generation has a right, just for its own benefit, to obligate those in generations to follow. He wrote, "Suppose that a previous generation has said to the moneylenders, 'Give us money that we may eat, drink, and be merry in our day.' Would the next generation," he asked, be obliged to pay the debt?" A good question worth thinking about. Well, so I think now what Greece means is that the real problem is not the financial crisis or unregulated capitalism. That's not the key element. The key and central element, is debt and the debt crisis. And the consequences are symbolized in what can happen to a nation completely, to lose, in a sense, its autonomy and its power. And it's not just the economic factor of this, but I think the moral irresponsibility that has been bothering people. That is, Jefferson suggests this. What is the right involved of one nation, one generation deciding to eat, drink, and be merry, and asking another generation to pay for it? What is the moral right of this? Something which is picked up today when people say, how can I ask my grandchildren to pay for my debts? And suddenly, from this point of view, the issues of income inequality, if that's a problem, you might feel good by speaking of social justice and humane treatment and spreading the wealth around now. But what about the injustice of leaving the next generation with the bill? Isn't that a much greater injustice than any conceivable injustice of the income distribution here and now? That's, I think, how many have come to see this, that there's the moral irresponsibility of not taking ownership of this problem and doing something about it. Well, what about the other elements of Europe? These aren't likely to play in the campaign, but it's given Republicans grounds to think, and certainly has led liberals to speak less of Europe. Namely, this idea of Europe expanding to all peoples on the basis of some humane idea of justice. Look at what is happening in Europe today. Who's speaking of the justice of the European community? What they're speaking of in the Euro crisis is saving the banks in France and saving the banks in Germany from an economic collapse. All the highfalutin elements of a universal model for world government have fallen by the wayside. It's as if they're fighting, or many are fighting, to save Europe for saving Europe, for no other reason. And then you ask about this idea of a secular or foundationless society. Many in America look at that and say, well, what does Europe actually stand for today? What is it that ennobles it under these circumstances, if it's fighting only to keep a currency alive and can't give any other reason? It led many to think that, maybe some firm foundation is the way to go. I think at least the American conservatives have taken some heart in turning back to American principles, finding now that not only is this something that they love, but something that can compete in the world as a model against this loose and lukewarm general humanitarianism. And so conservatives ask, is the wind on the side of Europe now? That, I think, is the great change just in the last year or two. Well, how has the left responded to this collapse in the image of Europe and in the collapse of its model? It no longer, as I said, ever speaks of Europe as the image or model. It avoids the reality altogether of what's happening there, and will try to run a campaign without ever referencing the debt crisis. It will keep building Europe while never uttering the name. And this can be seen from President Obama's Osawatomie speech, which he gave in Kansas a few weeks ago. This is taken to be kind of the statement of what the campaign is going to be about. He gave the speech in Osawatomie, maybe because people can't pronounce it, but also because that's where Theodore Roosevelt gave one of his most famous speeches, and he came and went to compare himself to Roosevelt and to offer an epic-making speech. But if you read that speech, the debt issue is mentioned in one sentence only. What's referenced is more important, and as the key to what's going on, is the problem of income inequality, of the 1% versus the 99%, and then the call for economic growth. But the economic growth, how is it to be achieved? Through new government spending in three areas: education, infrastructure, there's the high-speed rail again, and cutting-edge industries like solar energy. And the new spending will be paid for by taxation of the rich. But the old debt is never even mentioned. I believe there are two parties going into this election in November: the party of evasion and the party of reality. The party of reality may not have all the solutions, but the party of evasion cannot have the answers. It's hard to see on what basis it could successfully govern the country. Thank you. Yes, I'm supposed to let our students, I think, take microphones, and then people can hear this on webcast in Burma.
A first question then, Doctor. Two things you did not mention in your analysis of the Republican side of the campaign: your opinion on the need for cash and for a national organization, both of which we've seen as lacking in some of the minor candidates.
Yeah, right. I was basing it really only one aspect, but how the voters make their decisions. But sure, those elements are very important, and Romney's has more. But they also can be overestimated somewhat. I'd rather have a sustained appeal, than cash or organization, though I'd prefer to have all three. And you'd see the problem of what money can buy. Rick Perry's campaign in Iowa was very well funded, and yet hasn't been able to get off the ground. It's true that you could say that some of the candidates coming on suffer from this, but I would look at the campaign in 2008 of McCain. He was lucky to get nominated, but he had a very poor organization during the primaries, and at the point where, before he got going, very little money. So money follows success, and the problem is when you get it quickly, you don't know exactly how to use it because you don't have the organization and infrastructure. But I imagine that if Rick Santorum does well in New Hampshire, he'll be flush with cash, enough to pursue the campaign. But you're right, the absence of organization has already hurt these candidates, Santorum and Gingrich included. There's a number of states where they actually haven't even been able to file slates for delegates. So if it comes down to, the margins, that's where cash and organization help, at the margins. And of course, anyone planning a campaign, since they don't know what's going to happen, the only thing you can plan in advance that you know will remain stable is your cash and your organization. So everyone puts everything into it, even though it's only important at the margins. But oftentimes elections are run in the margins. Still say, though, if one of these candidates were really to catch hold and something were to become unpalatable about Mitt Romney, someone with weak organization and little cash could easily make up those deficits. Yes, we have to. Are you bringing the microphone now?
Thank you for your excellent presentation. There is a major change in voting rules in the Republican Party for the presidency. We have a proportional representation through April. One analyst made the claim that if those rules had been in effect in 2008, Romney would have been the nominee because McCain won a few winner-take-all big states, although he had probably only a plurality. What do you think of that kind of analysis?
Well, good work for political scientists. One thing to keep in mind, because in something about the rules, is that you can go back and run an election on different rules and get a result, except for one fact, that candidates would run their campaigns differently under different rules. Now, that's not to say that there's not an insight in your comment. McCain was able to win some winner-take-alls and parlay that as it went along and get the delegates, but still, people run elections under the rules that exist, and they put their resources in strategy because of the rules that exist to the extent that's important. So that's a point to keep in mind. This all came up in the 2000 election. Could George Bush have beaten Gore in the election if he had known that it was going to be about popular votes rather than electoral votes, if that was important? Well, they didn't do much to get out the vote in Texas because it didn't matter. He knew he was going to win Texas. So candidates always run under the rules that exist, and that's the slight problem I have with that analysis. That said, what really goes on in these races is there's the race for delegates, and then there's the race to show that you're the candidate who commands the majority. Both things are going on. The delegate race only makes a difference where it's close. And we saw that in 2008 between Hillary and Obama. But what counts initially is to show that you won a state, and that was true in 2008 to 2012. Most people aren't aware that the delegates are in the Republican Party for the first time are being awarded proportionally. They don't think of that. They say, gee, he won A, B, C, and D, and that can give an aspect of inevitability and momentum. So that's a long answer to the fact that sure it counts, but really what people are looking at initially is who wins these states. Yeah. Where are our microphones? Can we bring them around here?
Me?
Oh, good.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. It's
Okay.
whether the world...
I appreciate your insights this morning. A lot of people view the political spectrum as left versus right, liberal versus conservative. I'm of the opinion that it's liberty versus tyranny. And it's nothing less but an assault on our freedom. And a big part of our freedom you touched on is the debt. And as long as we're on a fiat debt-based money system, which is what Karl Marx, advocated, we're going to continue in this spiral down of debt. Do you see any candidates offering commodity-based currency as opposed to debt-based currency?
Well, Ron Paul has spoken of, moved a little bit in this direction. And while I have the floor, incidentally, I want to say something about Ron Paul. Let me take a minute to say it here because it's important. It's true that he's not going to get the nomination because he represents a slot that has a following in the Republican Party, but it's not anywhere near a majority. Nonetheless, this campaign is very interesting, at least for the future. It shows something of the appeal of libertarianism, which has grown. And look where he got a lot of his votes among young people and in college campus towns. And this reflects something that's been going on with the philosophy of libertarianism being discussed widely among younger people today and having a certain following. So it's not surprising that by far he was the candidate who did best in those areas of Iowa among the younger voters. But you can raise this and think a little bit about libertarianism. Obviously, Ron Paul has helped the cause by pushing this for years and now getting some recognition. But you could also ask whether he's hurt or limited the cause. And this question would go to the fact that is the foreign policy position that he articulates intimately and theoretically connected to the other parts of libertarianism? Or could you have imagined a candidate with a much more, let's say, traditional or somewhat traditional view of foreign policy with the libertarian domestic views? Could you imagine such a candidate doing a heck of a lot better than Ron Paul? Something to think about. Of course, you would have to go into the philosophy of libertarianism and ask theoretically whether there is some connection, however mild, between the domestic and the foreign view. And I think there is at least some possible connection, that libertarians really at heart believe in spontaneous order. So if there's spontaneous order in markets, why wouldn't there be spontaneous order in international relations? That's the connection. But I know libertarians who dispute that. The other thing is where Ron Paul has hurt the cause which he's helped is some of the people that he was been associated with over the years. But you can begin to imagine the significance of that movement, which I say won't win the Republican nomination, but it's interesting. Back to your question, where you might see the Republicans, mainstream Republicans going, as the conservatives or less conservative, is in a concerted effort at beginning to reduce debt. And they express it in terms, some express it in theoretical terms, like we should only have a state that says A, B, C, and D. That's part of it, but others express it in a more pragmatic way. They say, look, whatever our debates are about welfare state and what the role and function of government should be, can't we begin to agree on a number which would represent the maximum amount of percentage of gross domestic product that the federal government would spend, bringing it back to a range that we can afford? And I think that represents one view of a number of the candidates. Bring the spending down in 4 years from 24 or 25% to 20%. Which in fact means a heck of a lot of cutting and changing and altering the welfare state without arguing over the existence of the welfare state itself. This is an idea that the welfare state should be about as big as we can afford, but no bigger. And that's the position, for example, that Romney has suggested, that he's going to bring it down to 20%. Others have mentioned 18%. It's pretty close to the Paul Ryan plan. You read Paul Ryan, he doesn't say we're going to eliminate the welfare state. Or he doesn't propose a view that government, we should have some absolute theory of government which says exactly what functions it should perform. These are implicit in some of the parts of the plan, but the real essence of the plan is, look, whatever we're talking about, it's got to be in a range that we can afford. That should be the common good. And therefore, this actually means cutting back a lot of things. Some are uncomfortable with Romney on this basis. I've gone, as I mentioned, to hear him speak a few times, and he'll say there's some things that maybe government wouldn't be so bad if government were doing if we could afford it. But he says we can't, and the test I apply is it's so important that we'd be willing to go to debt to China to secure it. It's a different standard than the libertarian standard, but it begins to state a view that maybe Americans can live with. Yes? This gentleman here, we have the microphone. Can you bring it around here? Oh, yeah, here it is.
Well, you had mentioned about the welfare state. You had mentioned about the welfare state and what Mr. Romney may do, but as you well know, Dr. Paul has been a very strong advocate of getting rid of the welfare state because it's a major problem with the illegal immigrants as well. And but the question I'd like to ask is, as far as the different slots that you mentioned, what about the slot? Who is the one that is in the campaign that is the greatest defender of the Constitution?
Well, that wouldn't be an ideological slot. They all speak about the Constitution and how they love it. Who would be the greatest defender? Hard to say. Different people have different views of the Constitution on some of these issues. I really don't have an answer to who would be the greatest defender of the Constitution. It is heartening, though. This is one result of the Tea Party, that this document called the Constitution, which more or less was abandoned as a matter very much of public discussion, suddenly came back into the realm of public discussion, beginning really with the Tea Party. To the extent, for example, that Congress last year the House opened with a reading of the Constitution. Much to Nancy Pelosi's initial dismay, she came around and she read the clause which spoke of how you choose the Speaker of the House, too. So this is important because this question is, what is the Constitution? Is it merely a document that's manipulated or used by elites, namely lawyers in court cases? Is that the core of what a Constitution is? Or is it somehow a living document that's partly in possession of the public and the people, and that would guide our view of government? And I think you can give credit to a number of the candidates for that. Rick Perry, in his own way, wrote a book on this, or wrote a book with someone else on this, Fed Up. Speaks a lot about the Constitution. And others of the candidates have made it, they've at least bent on a need to the Constitution. So it's heartening to see this document return from being merely a lawyer's document to a document that can guide in a way the broad contours of policy in the United States. And I think that's what we really need to get back to in thinking about the Constitution. Yes, this case before the Supreme Court about Obamacare is interesting and important, and the rules of the Constitution should be followed in their technical legality. But just as important as the constitutional issue is, should you have something like Obamacare anyhow? Is this a function of the federal government? That's not something that's going to be decided in the courts. Yeah. So this would be an issue. You'd get back to asking the question, well, what's enumerated and which direction should we be going in? In a way, there's two kinds of constitutional discussions, therefore. There's the legal technical one, which is important, but I think not as important as the broad ideas the Constitution sets directions for the country that it's incumbent upon the parties and the political leaders to support. Can we get back in the back there? Charmaine.
Well, I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask my professor a question. I'm glad I don't have to write a paper at the end of it, but I have been thinking a lot about your class in the presidency as a result of this particular slate of candidates that we're faced with. In particular, the oops moment, thinking about the theme of charisma that you have written about and talk a lot about in your work. I'm kind of mixed emotions and mixed mind on, in terms of the modern presidency and how that particular moment and others similar to it have torpedoed Rick Perry. I mean, he makes the argument that, well, I shouldn't be totally judged based on my performance in debates, and in this particular campaign, it has had a larger role than others. But just to throw one more thought into this mix is the whole question of Mitt Romney and leadership versus management. So my overarching question with this, charisma, management, leadership, how do you see the academic literature on the presidency and who's qualified and best qualified coming to bear and to show us some light on this particular range of candidates?
Well, I'm not sure that the academic literature would be of much guidance on this issue, to be frank with you. But To go to the moment, this question of Perry's difficulties in the debates, I think that's one question hurt him, but that wasn't the only one. I don't think he was generally very strong in the debates. But you could say, given the system we have now, not imagining some other system, some people say, well, the debates counted too much, and as you know, in this election cycle, this race, the debates counted more than any other election cycle in the past. They've been really important. A lot of people have worried about that. Is debating the skill that should be important? But if you're going to keep the current system, you would have to say, okay, maybe debating isn't the most important skill, but what are the other things that would take its place under the circumstances that we have now? And what took the place, maybe better than worse, is campaigning. Campaigning and advertising. Under past circumstances, debates would count a little bit less, and what would count more is your daily campaigning and your television advertising. That's been the trade-off. It's not moving from the debates to some ideal view of judgment of virtues. And of course, people say, well, campaigning isn't that great either, especially in the modern mode. It's given to demagogy and look at television commercials. They're scandalous, many say. So I guess I'm not quite as down on the debates as others. They're all imperfect measures of what makes the good leader. With that, I agree. But our system doesn't have a perfect way to measure the good qualities of leaders. No system is perfect in that regard anyhow. Now, your other question about charisma and management. Yeah, I mean, this is the difference between 2008 and 2012. The race in 2008 was dominated by a charismatic candidate. You could say a charismatic disease. And here we shouldn't really blame Obama as much as one likes. What's really should blame is the need that people express to have a person like this. I mean, what's the real disease? Obama merely took advantage of it. He was the person who took advantage of it. And mind you, this was not an American movement. This was a worldwide movement. Obama was heralded, and still is heralded, but was heralded throughout the entire world. Heck, he wasn't running for president of the United States. He was running for president of the world. And almost literally, and conceived of himself. Now, maybe his problem was that the people, him and the people around actually began to believe this. That was the danger. But he did it, at least fulfill something. I'm not sure that the people in 2012 want that quite as much, whether that's quite as important to the American people this time around. They may have had their moment of charisma and of scratching their heads. And I think you're pointing to Romney. He's sure he doesn't inspire that way. He's maybe more than a manager, but he touts his managerial ability. And so he's going to have to say this is the fit for the moment, or it's the best you can get, one of the two. I think he can make an argument that it's a good fit for the moment, that we don't want the charisma, but in any case, it's going to boil down to two people, whatever their strengths or weaknesses. And if you look over the candidates in the past, they've all fallen short in a lot of ways. There's never been the perfect candidate, and we'll boil down to two individuals, whoever they are, and have to make a judgment with some lacking qualities you might otherwise wish them to have. Yes?
This will be our final.
Oh, okay. Well, then you assign it, David. Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about risks and dangers to Republicans that need to be avoided, particularly kind of like the Senate election, which is coming up. I'm thinking of the fact that we lost at least 2 Senate seats we should not have lost last time, and with the 2 Republican governors of Ohio and Wisconsin who moved under some pressure of the Republican Party, particularly in trouble in Ohio. So the question is, what needs to be avoided to prevent loss that otherwise might take place?
Well, the things you mentioned, just keep this in mind. In any movement, and the Tea Party was a movement, you have to balance out the good and the bad. And sure, you can make the fine distinctions, and the Republicans could have controlled the Senate with 2 better, let's say, nominations. But look at the sorts of persons in the Tea Party that have been brought into the government and have given renewed energy to the Republican Party. So no one ever can fine-tune a movement. That's the character of a movement. It's big, it's flat-footed, it pushes, sometimes it pushes too far, and that's what I think happened in Nevada and in Delaware. Just, it was a cup of tea too far. You ought to put it that way. But look at the others, like Rubio. I mean, others. Boy, the people who were initially saying, "Well, let's back Christ." I mean, look at the difference between those. And a lot of the Tea Party or Tea Party influence candidates are terrific and have served the Republican Party well. So part of the answer is you're never going to be able to calibrate it perfectly or do the perfect slot. Things to avoid. Well, it's pretty obvious. I would say that you want to stick to these. To the central issues of the day, and I believe the central issues really do revolve around the debt, the sustainability of liberal democracy, and the moral issues connected with the debt, and that the other issues would take, however important, would be second to that dominant theme.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.